Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Brothers and sisters of the P&T, down on the farm. Down on the farm. We need to pay more attention to what's happening down on the farm, is what I want to say today. One of the things I'm interested in, you've probably picked up on it over the years, is the question of what topics attract scholarly attention. What our sense organs and powers of reason are attracted to, what draws us in. And if you've been listening to the show, you know that I argue that hype, or unrealistic expectations and narratives about near-term technological and social change, drives a lot of work in fields of technology studies. This, despite how often people like to call themselves critical. Not really sure what the word critical means anymore, but it certainly doesn't mean something like critical thinking. Like, for example, digital technology is important in some ways and by some measures, but is just bananas how much scholarly attention digital technologies get today. In some areas of technology studies, like media studies is a good example, it's almost guaranteed that grad students will work on some digital topic. You know what gets a lot less attention in these fields? What's happening down on the farm. Now this, despite the fact that one of the biggest, deepest, most important material transformations in the past 200 years is how productive agriculture has become during that period. For example, still in the 1920s, about 50% of Americans worked on farms. How many of us work on farms now? In 2022, the number was 1.62%. But meanwhile, the amount of agricultural output in the US and all around the globe has continued to rise. And it's not like a lot of this change has happened only in the distant past. Don't let yourself off the hook, dear technology studies scholars, by pretending all this change happened over 100 years ago. No, not at all. The productivity of American farms has basically doubled between World War II and the present, for example. And according to one chart I was looking at this morning, American farmers produce something like 3 times the amount of food today that they did in 1950. Indeed, the fact that they produce so much food with so little labor is why so many of us today do not need to work down on the farm. It's amazing how little work in technology studies examines this most fundamental material shift in our culture. That's why I was so happy to see the publication of Joshua Brinkman's recent book, American Farming Culture and the History of Technology. Now, Josh is a graduate of my department of Science, Technology, and Society here at Virginia Tech, and I had heard of him and his work for many years before finally meeting him in this interview. Joshua worked closely with former P&T guest and Virginia Tech professor of history, Richard Hirsch, who you may remember wrote a revisionist history of rural electrification in the United States. And the pair of them wrote an interesting essay on rural technologies in the journal Technology and Culture titled Welcoming Wind Turbines and the PIMBY, Please in My Backyard phenomenon, the culture of the machine in the rural American Midwest. Josh's work examines how cutting-edge technologies play a central role in farmers' self-images and self-concepts. In fact, many of the things that bother critics of American agriculture, like the rise of high-productivity factory farms, using mechanized technologies, and biotech to no end, seeds, fertilizers, and pest control agents, are precisely what farmers pride themselves on. Because as Josh shows, farmers, both men and, importantly, women, see themselves as business people working at the bleeding edge of efficiency and modernity. And even if we want to reform aspects of our agricultural systems, and there are plenty of problems, plenty of things worth reforming, we need to understand how farmers see themselves including so that they find proposals for reform attractive and worth doing. In this way and others, Josh's work opens up many new vistas for future research. In addition to his work as a professor of STS, Josh is also an accomplished saxophonist and jazz musician. You can check out the music of two of his current bands, the fabulous Nite-Life Boogie and Les Trois Shots. Online, I'll put those names in the show notes. And as you'll hear in the interview, Josh is considering making the history of music technology his next area of inquiry. Down on the farm. Down on the farm. We in technology studies have so much to learn from research like Josh Brinkman's that's teaching us about what's happened down on the farm. From my mountaintop perch, sitting above hayfields and cow pastures, I could not be happier to see it. And that's why I say, hey, get excited! Josh, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks for having me.
American Farming Culture and the History of Technology is a cool book that trucks right down my dirt road. So what's it about, and what were you trying to do with it?
Well, it's about, it uses farmers really as a case study to argue that people don't use technology just for articulated rational purposes or economic purposes, but to form and perform their identities. And this performative use is what I call it, to perform their identities, is expresses kind of a whole suite of non-spoken identities that are evident through discourses surrounding technology that they use. And these identities become embedded within the technologies themselves, so that using the technology and working with the technology is a performative practice that constantly reinforces the identity of the user. And so in the case of the Midwest, in terms of farmers, there's several bundles of discourses and identities over time in rural America, due to historical circumstances that identify, that can be described and understood. And my argument is that, when really looking at modernity and the modernization of agriculture, most studies or most conversation about it kind of revolves around very simple economic explanations for
Right.
modernization.
Yeah.
Or they leave the farmer out of it completely, right?
Right.
It's about systems. It's about
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's like production just fucking
Right.
happening, right? And
it's about the USDA. It's about the extensions, and this modernization comes down onto farmers that have no agency in the process.
yes.
And so I
Yeah.
tried to insert the farmer back into the story, and I'm really trying to write the book from the farmer's perspective.
That's right.
I'm trying to let the farmer speak for himself or herself.
Yeah.
And so I'm not interested, for example, the term industrialized agriculture, or
Yes.
I'm not really interested in whether it really is industrialized or not. I'm interested in how farmers themselves see it.
Uh-huh.
And I'm also interested how women on farms see themselves.
Great.
So I have a chapter on kind of women on farms and how they see themselves as production, as productive, as part of the production process, part of the business, even though there might be somewhat of a male hierarchy or a I'm interested in what the women themselves think of what they're doing and what the
Right.
technology means to them.
Yep.
And so that's why I wrote the book, and it really comes out of my own personal history. I come from a farm family in Iowa, and when I was kind of deciding what to write about for my dissertation, I noticed that what I experienced growing up, visiting farmers, being in that world, wasn't being reflected in histories of agriculture. And I thought STS, that deals with all kinds of neat ideas like performativity and identity and social constructivism and use, like Edgerton and Wu Schwartz Cohen and David Nye and all of these people, if you had a lot to add to the literature and to our understanding of why farmers
Yeah.
use technology.
Yeah.
So that's why I wrote it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. And I want to, there was Yeah, I wasn't sure what order to put the next couple questions in, but I think I'm going to switch how I wrote it. All right, so I think
Okay.
one thing I would like to kind of get on the table is, what you deal with is there's a lot of different narratives and the images and stuff you're pushing back against, but I think something you write about is that there's a lot of images in our culture broadly about rurality as backwardsness, basically. And you're and yokels and hicks, these terms you write about. And and you're writing about the American Midwest, but you went to school here at Virginia Tech. You know Appalachia. You live in North Carolina now. Um, the Appalachia has this whole set of, images of backwardsness, just like the Midwest and other rural parts of America do, even maybe even more. And yet, like, part of what you're showing is like the bullshitness of this, like that farmers have always been, deeply engaged in modern technologies and even like signaling this, right?
Yeah, I identify what I call it a pattern of audience, but all it really means is that farmers going back to really the 1700s with German agrarianism have performed their identities as modern with objects, even when they weren't called technology yet,
Right. Right.
and performed their success right as producers, and so farmers have always used and this really accelerated in the 1920s when you get the rural urban conflict and you get a shift in demographics to from rural to urban in America in general. And farmers went from kind of this Jeffersonian hero status to this what you're calling pejorative, hick rube,
Yeah.
whatever you want to use.
Yeah.
And farmers started to my argument is that's when they started to take these things that were very important in rural culture and combine them with kind of modern progress ideologies to use the latest technology to debunk this stereotype.
Right.
And they've been doing that, I argue, ever since that time period, particularly now where the performance is look how modern I am.
Yeah.
And a lot of time and really but yet this stereotype persists, right? This,
That's right. I mean, yeah, it's one of these things that it's impossible to debunk sociologically. Even though the farmers are like putting forward a different image, it's not getting into the popular image or something like that, right?
yeah, and it serves to continue the performative use,
Yeah.
and I have a whole chapter about how this negative stereotype kind of, has affected the Midwest psyche in
Mhm.
unexpected ways. There's kind of a inferiority complex, but there's also this performance, and,
Right.
uh, you look at modern agriculture. I have a chapter about silly things like, Green Acres or something like that, where the character is using some tractor from the early 1900s, in the show in the 60s at a time when the tractors are using the latest, engine technology that's not even in automobiles yet.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and even today, I mean, you look at what farm. I mean, I was just at my uncle's farm. I mean, the tractor drives itself. It's connected to GPS. It's really, really high tech. They're using big data. They're using all and so yet, most urban people have no idea that this is happening, and farmers
Right.
know this. When you talk to farmers, they say, I'm not just these urban people think we do this, but we're really modern and we do. So
Right.
it's part of the Midwest psyche. It's part of the
Yeah.
mindset to kind of show how modern they are and how productive they can be, and
Yeah.
really, to them, the discourse revolves around feeding the world, right?
Yeah.
We feed the world, which goes back to Jeffersonian. Instead of upholding democracy as God's chosen people was part of Jeffersonianism. Now the hero identity is that we feed the world, right? We are the ones feeding the world. So why are you looking down on us as anti-modern? I mean, this corn's going to Japan and China and
Right.
whatever.
And the other place, so
So
the other place I was going to start, I mean, but I kind of switched it around, kind of to provide more context, is that you start with this question of like, why do farmers take pictures with their technologies? And I thought that was a really beautiful, and that this is part of your experience. It's like what you do when you've taken part of this. You have lots of photos. I think you say at one part that fit this bill, and so you're also looking at just like these kind of material representations produced by the farmers themselves, right? Yeah. It's not just ideas. Like there's like physical representations that come out they're producing.
Yeah, it's that the using the technology reinforces and taking pictures and the actions that they take with the technology reinforces this rural modernity, this rural identity. And yeah, I start off with this notion of taking photos with farm equipment because
Yeah.
every time you go to I would go back to the farm, like most people when they go back to visit their family, they don't all get in front of the car and take a
Right,
picture,
right.
right?
There
But
is that tradition older. I think it's mostly disappeared. People used to take pictures of the cars a lot more, right? But
yeah.
you're right that that's mostly disappeared. But you're saying it still exists in other places, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. And, like, I just took my daughter back to see the farm for the first time this summer, at 11, she's 11, and the first thing we did is she jumped on the old farm mall and drove it, because that's what you do when you're in the family and you go back it's like a rite of passage to drive this old tractor. They don't even use it anymore. Why do we keep it around? Why do we, if it's all about economics, it's uneconomical to keep this old 1930s farm mall in. We use it just to reinforce our
Totally.
ruralness, our identity as rural people.
Yeah.
And my grandfather did the same with the barn, right? There's an old barn on my dad's farm where he grew up milking cows. That hasn't been used since the early 90s or the 80s. But he put new siding on it and spent all this money to do that. Well, what's that all about, right?
Right.
So that yet when we talk about agriculture, it's all about economics and getting the most yield. Well, no, it's
Yeah,
not.
yeah.
There's something else going on here, right?
Yes.
Um, that's deeper than that. That's not being represented.
Yeah, well, and
Um,
just to like one other point on this kind of your experiences and what you're drawing attention to, that you had this wonderful sentence. When my wife first visited the farm, her initiation into the family included sitting on the early 1950s Farmall M my father drove as a teenager. After all, in my family, one cannot be a true Brinkman without sitting on the old Farmall. And it's like this wonderful, I saw it as like this religious ritual, it's like an anointing. It's like,
yeah,
now you're one of us, like
exactly. Exactly. It's like a tribal ritual to be in the tribe, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, and so obviously technology means more to these people than the rational economic,
yeah,
understanding. It's
that's
it's
right.
more it's about legacy and like I started thinking more about that. Why do we keep old equipment? Why are there shows of old farm tractor shows that people go to and spend all day and spend all this money? And I realized it fits into this modern discourse, right? It's to show how and it's um you would think, oh, it's just nostalgia. People do that with old cars too, but it's different in the Midwest. I think, and what I realize is that the reason is it's physical proof of how far the family came. It's physical proof of progress that now we used to have this, and now look what we have. Look how far we've come. Look how big the tractor is. Look
Interesting.
how advanced it is. So it's not just a family legacy thing, but it's also physical manifestation of progress that the family has made in modernizing. And that's a very different discourse than like an organic discourse about agriculture or a critique of industrial agriculture.
Right.
It kind of sees it's moralizing. It sees the newest as moral because it represents how far the family has come and how much, the moralization of work, which is part of any agrarian culture, um, which is different from like an organic discourse that kind of sees everything after the Green Revolution as kind of a
Dirty
de-evolution,
or something.
morally
Yeah, yeah,
de-evolution,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's really what the debate's about to me. It's not they throw numbers at each other and science at each other, but it's really about the morality of contemporary farming. Uh,
Right. Well, and that's interesting because, then it suggests if you want the people on the other side of an issue to come over to your side, you better understand their self-understanding and how they see these things, right? Um,
exactly.
yeah. Yeah. I
Right.
mean, it was interesting. I mean, like um, how can I put this? I was involved in discussions with an automaker about electric vehicles and imagery around such things, in
Yeah.
particular pickup trucks. And they were really thinking a lot about how to make
these things as gritty, it's modernity, but it's gritty modernity that can like, you can use your truck as a battery to drive tools and stuff. I mean, this is part of their vision. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And it's all
Yeah.
about them trying to like get in the head of who they actually want to buy these things. They don't want just like rich doctors who want a big ass truck. Like if they're going to get into the market in a serious way, they actually have to appeal to people who have like, so it's just interesting. Like I just saw you kind of bringing this up too, of like really recreating trying to recreate the perspective of one group looking at a technology.
Yeah, I actually bring this up in my class when we're talking about, I mean, just look at a lot of the things I looked at to kind of tease out this social meaning where commercials and advertisements, I mean, look at every truck advertisement. It's like that's why I love the Simpsons, Canyonero, right? It's so every truck commercial is like that, right? It's
Uh-huh.
like like it's the West. It's the myth of the West that's wrapped around this thing. That's
Yes.
not that we take for granted because we're American. Like every truck commercial since I've been a kid has been a cowboy like loading hay into the back of the
Right.
F-150. But that's not a inevitable association, right? That's a
Right.
socially historically constructed association.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and it's persistent. It's remarkably, it's like one of the things I like about Edgerton, he has this term rehashed futurism.
Uh-huh.
There's these rehashed social meanings that are kind of uncreative in many ways, but
Mm-hmm.
they persist because they're so deeply embedded and we take them for granted and they're assumptions that the
Mm-hmm.
pickup truck is associated because we're Americans, we associate space with freedom, we associate the West with, you know,
Yeah.
um, we're still going west, right? There's still a west in our minds, even though the frontier's gone.
Yeah.
We're obsessed with moving. Like we like our space. We like space around us. Go to Europe, people sit together at tables. We don't like that. Give me my space. Freedom's my space. Well, that pickup truck is that space,
Definitely
right?
is that
So
space. Yeah.
yeah, um, all that stuff is like embedded in that truck.
Yeah.
And you go to Europe, you don't see them. You don't see pickup trucks, because they don't have it, there's no myth of the West. It's
Yeah.
not
It's
part of the
not
culture.
connected up. Yeah. Um, I saw something you were doing in the book. So we've talked a bit about Edgerton. And I think that you have a very kind of use focused approach in your book. It's about how and why farmers are using this technology. But as you've already been doing it, what I saw you is like extending it, kind of extending it out a bit to then talk about like identity and what you call the performative dimension, right? And I think, this fits into a broader pattern too. We can talk about Veblen and how we use for technologies for way more than just the economic or productive. So that was what I kind of saw. Does that sound right to you, that you're working in this kind of use perspective, but part of what you're trying to do is like draw it out and say like, yeah, but it's also about self-image and in performing a certain way of being in the world.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up Veblen, also Pierre Bourdieu.
Uh-huh.
This whole idea that we do things that are embodied performative practices where we're not even necessarily even thinking about it, right? There's a difference between because people think, oh, it's obvious that people are want to have an image, but this is a little different than conscious thinking that you want an image, right? This is an embodied cultural practice that is formed over time because of historical circumstances that you might not even know you're doing. um and we all do that, right? It's not just That's why I say this is a case study, right?
Yes.
We all use objects in embodied ways that we don't even choose consciously to do, but we do it because it's so heavily embedded in the way, why did I wear this shirt today? Why did I get up and
Yeah.
decide to put this shirt on or comb my hair this
Right.
way or do whatever I did? It's embodied, right? So every time they start that tractor, they're reaffirming that identity, even though no one's watching, because it's an embodied practice with the technology. So yeah, I'm kind of extending out the use Edgerton work and combining it with kind of that Bordeaux Veblen embodied identity idea to think about what these objects really mean to farmers and why they use them the way they do. Um, Yeah, and also David Nye, kind of social meaning of technology
Yeah, right.
stuff. I'm really influenced by that work as well, where he
Yeah.
does, he talks about electricity and the great white ways and he has this great line, and I forget which paper. It might be in Electrifying America, but it might be in an earlier paper where he talks about the ball, the New Year's Eve ball in Times Square,
Yeah.
and he talks about how it's a visible discourse. It's a moving discourse that it's not just a light. It imparts a whole set of middle class ideals like respect and respect of property, the progress of technology, the trust in business. All of these middle class values is like um uh within that social practice of dropping the ball on New Year's Eve, and it's like a moving discourse.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's kind of what I'm saying is like this. There's a discourse that's not spoken, that's embodied, this is also a moving discourse. When that tractor starts to go down the field, and it's the newest, best modern thing, and that's the point of it. It's not just to harvest corn faster
Yeah.
or cheaper or more efficiently. It's to reinforce that moving discourse of modern rural capitalistic modernity that comes out of the 20s and 50s. It's not an inevitable image. It's not an inevitable self-image, right? Farmers before that farmed communally. They were, you have these threshing reunions and these where they would get together and thresh a farmer's field. This is different. It's very individualistic. It's very competitive. It's very um faith in modernity, right? It's not necessarily inevitable.
And so the way you get at this, it could be different. It's not inevitable. Is by looking at these six discourse identity bundles, is what you call them, but you can also think of them as like traditions or ways of being that you're kind of showing play out over time. And so you start back in the 18th and 19th century, and you look at German agrarianism and Jeffersonian agrarianism. And I think, if in the United States, I think we were taught about kind of Jeffersonian agrarian ideals in high school and stuff. We have some image of this thing as like, being the master of our own destiny, having land, having this very masculine identity around these things, but also how that how that contributes to the nation, and it's very virtuous and all these kinds of things. But the German agrarian identity, German agrarianism, I think, and please feel free to add on to what you think is the essence of the Jeffersonian thing. But the German agrarianism, I think, is not so familiar in general. Right? I think some people would know about it, but it's not. Yeah. So tell us a bit about that. I mean, I understand there's a lot of German immigrants in the Midwest. I'm from the Midwest, including from German families. So believe me, I get that part
Yeah.
of it. But tell us about what the German agrarian tradition is.
Yeah, I think it has several elements as well as Jeffersonian agrarianism does. I mean, these identities and these rural discourses have many elements in them, and for the German agrarianism, and you see this interestingly. I look at a book produced by Benjamin Rush in the 1780s, where he is, Benjamin Rush isn't German. He's English. He was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was a Enlightenment elite, but he was from Pennsylvania, and his project as an Enlightenment scholar was, they're trying to modernize agriculture in early America in the way Enlightenments would, right? They have societies and they have competitions to modernize, but it's from an English agrarian perspective. Well, Rush looks over here and he sees all these really productive German people in
Huh.
Pennsylvania, and he thinks, how are these people so productive when they're backward? They can't even read and write, most of them. They came from poor parts of Germany, but they're doing things that we can't do over here in our modern Enlightenment world. How is this possible? So he does what an Enlightenment scholar does, and he goes and he studies them. He makes notes
Fascinating,
of
yeah.
everything they do. He classifies them, and so what's left is this really detailed history of how these German farmers were in Pennsylvania in the
Fucking A, man.
1780s. Yeah, and it's interesting because I see parallels between that and my own German farming family in Iowa. There's several elements here of German agrarianism that I identified from that and other sources. One is the performance aspect of objects that we would later call technology, but at the time were just tools, right? So they would invest money not in their house to make their house fancy, but in their barns and in their fences, because part of it is anything that produces is performative. It's proper to have it's improper as a bragging um, bragging to have a fancy house or something like that. But it's okay. It's proper to have the latest barn, the latest horse equipment. And that's how you perform your success as a producer. And that's part of German agrarian culture.
Okay.
And Rush notes this when he goes and looks at the Germans in the 1780s. He also they also use only family members to produce. There's no use of slaves or hired help, because your family and you are the only ones that can work your land. And work, because work is very, very moralized. It's very highly valued. It's almost even more than like a Calvinistic sense. It's what makes a person moral is work. Um, and there's also less gendered labor. So women on these German farms are doing the same tasks the men are doing.
Right.
Which is not happening on English farms. English farmers have a more defined gender role in work processes. And the goal of the English farmers was to have slaves, was to avoid labor, was to avoid work, physical work. Whereas the German physical work was like the highest thing you could do. It made you moral. And there's also an obsession with personal property ownership, because a lot of these Germans were Hessian soldiers or they were indentured servants in the 1700s. And so to actually own their own land was the highest thing you could do. And they also bequeathed land differently. They divided land equally among both male and female.
Well, that goes back to Germany, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, and the English had primogeniture, right?
Right.
They had the oldest son. Even when they changed the laws in colonial America to not have that, that practice continued, where the oldest son would get everything.
Yeah.
And then then the daughters would get almost nothing. So there's all of those aspects of German agrarianism that, and they're also very, very careful with money, because everything is produced back into stuff that produces. So he makes points, small things like they would take the best milk that they produce, instead of consuming with the family, that would be sold, and then they would eat the stuff nobody wanted. Like sauerkraut was originally that, right? It was stuff nobody else wanted to eat.
Wow.
And the best things they produced was for the market in Philadelphia. And they invented most people don't know this, but they invented the Conestoga wagon that was later used for the West. German farmers invented that to haul stuff to Philadelphia. Yeah, and they also had knowledge that seemed that would later prove to be right scientifically, but they knew it in a folk way that seemed medieval or backward to the British observers, but it was actually correct agriculturally. So like when you plant, how you clear fields, how you plant this.
Yes.
So it was a folk knowledge.
That's right. Yeah.
And they also produced the first agricultural journals in the United States that the English Enlightenment, more educated farmers could never quite produce. The Germans produced the first ones. So there's a definite there's a definite German agrarian culture that is brought over from Germany and moved westward, as you said.
Yeah.
German is like German American is almost like the least recognized ethnic group because of, World War One. Nobody wanted to be
Right,
German.
right, right,
But
right.
if you look at the Midwest and you look at a map of like German
Oh yeah.
heritage, the whole upper Midwest, I mean, Wisconsin's like 65%, something like
Yeah,
that.
dude.
It's
Yes.
every single county in like Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, the area that really I'm studying, the highest ethnic group is by far German American. So it's, this culture moved, literally, these people moved into the Midwest, and the farmers in the South that were trying to get away from the elite slave owning brought the Jeffersonian, and they combined together in the Midwest to form, to inform later, identities. And so part of my argument is this modern capitalistic modernity that happened in the 20s in the Midwest took some elements of this German, some elements of this Jeffersonian, and combined them with modern progressive discourse that was actually coming from urban America,
Yes.
and produced a uniquely rural modernity that was
Yeah.
unique to the Midwest.
Well, let's go
And I,
there. I mean, like,
yeah,
before we get to that moment, why don't we do the kind of earlier urban industrialism? Because I think I mean, that's kind of where progressive era stuff. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe I would take that back what I'm about to say if I read the newest literature. But like, I think when we think of the progressive movement and the roots of that, it is very city focused. There's a lot of urban reform movements going on. And it's also, as you point out, this moment where, because of the rise of mass production and the factory systems and all these things, there's a lot of movement to cities. So this is it's like in the 1870s where you really see the decline. You start to see the decline in rural places and moving to cities. It's only like in 1920 or something that we hit like 50-50. It's still a very rural place, but urbanization is starting. So why don't we just start there with how you see like farmers, because you're looking from the farmer's perspective. How do they react to that kind of urban industrialism moment?
yeah, that's one of the parts of my book that I had to think the most about um, because and something that when I actually that when I sent it in, my reviewers noted, which is, part of my argument is that Midwesterners and farmers, they form their own Midwest modernity or rural modernity in response to urban industrialism, to combat the threat that they saw from growing urban power in the 1920s. And that was not just economic power, it was political power, it was cultural power. Because 1920 is the first census where over 50% of the American population is urban. And in the 20s, the Roaring 20s missed the Midwest. It missed not the Midwest. It missed the rural areas. The cities were booming, with manufacturing and Fordism and the growth of the stock market, but farm prices actually dropped after World War One. And the reason was, once World War One ends, all the farmers in the Europe start to farm again, and they drive down the price of commodities. And so farmers in the Midwest are hurting. The depression comes early to rural America in the 20s. And farmers know this. And there's a farm bloc that forms in Congress that's promoted by Wallace, who produced Wallace's Farmer, which is one of the big sources I used. He was head of the USDA. Um, to have price controls and to have something called the McNary-Hagen bill, which was basically a way of the federal government buying surplus grain to prop up the price. And Coolidge vetoed it. And farmers were really mad about this because they said Coolidge is in the pocket of big business and the railroads. Um, and so there's a pushback against urban America, but there's also at the same time, paradoxically, an embrace of progressivism. And so you have the populist and progressive movement had a lot of farmer support actually, and farmers voluntarily participated in the extension systems and by the universities, and they did their own. They started to part of this modern identity was farmers started to do their own experimentation. Like a lot of the early hybridization was done by farmers themselves that took the knowledge they learned from, university professors and USDA scientists at the extensions, and they brought it to their farms, and they, or they redesigned machinery to do things they wouldn't normally do and learn like engineering skills. They would take engineering classes. So you have this strange, but then at the same time, you have progressives, like you have the Country Life Commission report by Roosevelt that basically are in 1919, I think 1917, maybe earlier, but yeah, 19 teens that basically argued that farmers were backwards, right? Rural America was backward. It was full of all these ills. It had bad education, and farmers took umbrage of that. They said that all of these, educated city people are telling us how to farm and what to do, and they're telling us we're not. And they responded with their own reports. There's a bunch of farm women got together and produced a report trying to debunk all of that, saying, and it framed women as bored on these farms and not as sophisticated and pining to be urban. And these women said, no, we're actually more modern than urban women because we're part of the business, and it's a healthier place to raise children, and we actually we are modernizing too. A lot of women on farms were in charge of like egg production and animal production, and they were using modern. These weren't small operations. They were
Right.
selling to New York City and
Yeah.
places. They were business women.
Right.
And they brought this up in the report. And so there's an embrace of progressivism that's that's combining with Jeffersonian German values to create a new urban modernity. But there's also a resentment of urban
Right.
progressive actors
Yes.
at the same time. And that's kind of counterintuitive, but when you think about it, that happens a lot, right? It's kind of like you think about colonialism, like part of this idea of multiple modernities I got from reading a completely unrelated book by Avi Rubin about Ottoman court culture. And he talks about kind of Ottoman modernity that took European modernity and made it
Very nice. Yes.
uniquely Ottoman or Turkish. And so they resisted colonialism, but they're also adopting some of the
Of course. Yeah.
European, Anthony Giddens,
Yes.
faith in new technology, faith in the new. So farmers are doing the same thing.
Yeah.
They're adopting urban discourse but they're resisting anything that takes power and productive power away from the family farm. So there's all these farms in the 20s. Most people don't know this, by people like Samuel Insull, who was the businessman for General Electric, right? When it really started to get going in the 20s, he actually he was a partner with Edison. And he started something called Hawthorne Farm in the Midwest that literally tried to create a factory farm. And other people tried to do this where farmers would live in barracks and they would use the latest technology, and then they would go home to their families at night, just like a factory worker would. And they would get paid a regular salary, and they would have access to electric lighting, which most rural people didn't have at the time. So if you look at it in a purely economic sense, these farmers were actually better off. They had no risk of, weather failing or crops failing
Yep.
because they got a regular salary.
Yep.
But farmers universally rejected this. Why? Because it violated German and Jeffersonian agrarianism of control over work processes, of the family at the center of work.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That's
So,
nice.
yeah.
And you can see like the Monsanto, like self-killing seeds and all these kind of later struggles around kind of modern biotech and technology, like in this earlier moment of like wanting to maintain independence as like a really core value there, right?
Yeah, you see this today in modern agriculture, right? You see embrace of some technologies, but resistance of others.
Right.
And the only way you
Yes.
understand that is by understanding the rural point of view.
Yeah.
Because if you just say they like the newest thing, well, that's not true. There's resistance to big hog lot operations.
Yep.
That because it takes control away from the farmer.
Or
There's
just like,
resist-
I mean, look how they're reacting, like the right to repair movement and their reaction to John Deere, which like
Right.
the way they set it up, you're like dependent on them for repairs. They're like, fuck that. Like you got farmers buying tractors from the 70s and stuff in some places just to like, so they don't have to have that sense of dependence on an external force, right?
Yeah, that was the exact example I was just about to bring up, the right to repair movement. They're actually there's farmers that actually get software from Ukraine and Eastern Europe
Right,
to
right.
hack into their own John Deere
Yeah, that's
tractor.
right. Yeah.
And that takes a really high technical
Right.
skill to do, right?
Right.
But they're doing it.
Right.
And there's other examples like they're embracing big data, but they really distrust, outsourcing it to the cloud or to a third party. Um, there's yet, there's other technologies that they embrace because it keeps control of the process that urban people actually don't like the self-driving tractor, right? There's a
Yeah.
prototype for
Hmm.
a tractor that literally has no farmer on it. There's no cab. Um, and the urban reports, it's interesting. The urban reports from kind of tech magazines or tech people on the coast is this is bad, right? That it removes the farmer from farming,
Right.
because their stereotype is a farmer on a tractor.
Right. 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 Right.
But when you look at farm publications or Midwest publications or farmers writing about it, they embrace it because they're already sitting at their computer using big data. This is
Yeah.
just they're still in control of work.
And they'll
What they
control the
care about.
drone, right? I mean, it's
Exactly.
their drone.
Yeah, it's their drone and it's their land and they're in
Yeah.
control of so what they care about isn't being on the tractor, it's control over work. That's why my point is you have to look at the rural point of view. You can't see it from an urban point of view because there's a unique rural modernity that cares about different things, that looks
Yeah.
at the world a different way.
I was thinking,
Um,
there's a couple more things I want to kind of march through the book and ask you, but I just had a thought come up of like, how do you think like this is a whole other topic and it would be another book, but I just like first instincts of like how like part-time immigrant labor might fit into your story, like how they relate to it. I don't know, it's a big empirical question actually, not one we can, but it's just kind of fascinating to think about like there's the farmers who own, their farm and you can also say like the means of production, but there are in some contexts at least also like these workers who come in who do like part-time seasonal labor and stuff like that.
right. I know that you're doing work on, I think the term is shit jobs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you looking at, part-time, like, seasonal migrant farm
Well,
labor?
this is like part of it is whenever the book is kind of like a 70s to the present book, but I try to not make claims that I don't think will hold up. And I think so
Yeah,
like, I think you have to draw back to like often been part-time, very insecure jobs, especially, inhabited by racial minorities and blah blah, we can kind of go down that line that were always shit jobs. There's always been shit jobs around. The question is, who's doing them and, you know, and big economic questions. But yeah, it's
yeah,
there.
I was actually it'd be interesting because I was actually I had this conversation, I'm kind of doing some research work with Crystal Cook Marshall.
Oh yeah,
Crystal
yeah, yeah. She's interesting. Another tech grad,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, we were
Yeah.
in grad school together.
Uh-huh.
We actually shared an apartment in grad school. We took a lot of classes. She does stuff on, Appalachia and coal country and rural
Yeah.
people in that space.
Yeah.
And she was telling me about, and she works with a lot of like agricultural extensions in her day job, and she has more contact with, I guess, immigrant migrant labor than I do. And she was telling me about how there's work that she's doing and that she's collaborating with some people about how to make how to preserve the bodies of these workers that have these very demanding jobs on their bodies and how to make their job easier. And a lot of efforts they've done have failed because they introduced something uh, like a back brace or something like that, or that's just an example. And these workers actually take it off because that's not how they do it. So in a way, on a they're not in control of their job. They have much less power than farmers that own their farm, and they're economically being taken
Right.
advantage of. But on a micro level, on a use level, right? If you
Right.
look at to Edgerton, they actually are asserting their agency over what they're doing
They have
at that
folk
moment.
ways about what they're up to too, right? In
Yeah, and they
traditions.
actually pick a lot of these vegetables with bare feet.
Right.
She was telling me,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering if that is a folk way that goes that
Yeah.
right. So there's ways of you can see it as I'm really influenced by Ray-Ban Fouché and the stuff he does with like Black Technological Agency.
Yeah.
I
Yeah, I
want
loved how you
you could
brought that in. Yeah, and the
yeah,
turntable and stuff. Yeah.
the turntable and
Yeah.
stuff, right? I
Yeah.
wonder if that is kind of like migrant technological agency in some weird way.
Yeah, it would be I hear you. Yeah. And also, I mean, the like I create some kind of like, back brace technology that's almost leaning towards like body armor or something like that. And I think it's going to help you with your job, which I don't do.
Yeah,
And then
exactly.
I wonder how it feeds into like design questions about just actually including the people you're designing for and stuff like that. Like whether that's the tension or whether it's just like fuck you, I'm not going to use this technology because that's not how we do it. And like
Right.
there's like it could be that too. Yeah.
And I know how to pick these things the fastest way
Yeah.
and what is this thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of almost like appropriate technology, like why and that's really as parallels in agriculture. I mean, there's all these great examples of someone giving a, tractor to some part of Africa, but
Yep.
their agriculture doesn't use tractors and they have
Right.
their own way of farming that works. Like it's kind of colonialist. It's kind of how dare you think you can do it better than me, someone in Africa that grows this, they've been growing this thing for generations and you come in and say, "Oh, I'm the savior from the West with my tractor," right?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
almost it's kind of like it reminds me of that in many ways.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. And this is somewhat related. I wanted to dig into the nice chapter, but also theme you have throughout the book about women a bit more. And I thought this was very interesting because I think that again, in these stereotypes about rural culture and farmers, I think there's this image that it's very patriarchal, and maybe in some ways it is patriarchal. Maybe there is male domination in very serious ways. It's also true that some of the voices I know personally and are kind of public figures too around kind of like trying to reconnect to the rural, trying to reconnect to farming, are women who are, very committed to their family traditions and these kinds of stuff. They're not just kind of like going along for the ride with some dude. They are like they're involved and they're doing it for a reason, and like they have ideas about this. And so I thought that you draw that out in nice ways. That it's not, that the like how how women represent themselves and how they see themselves. So just say it. You've already said a little bit, but just kind of dig in on that a bit more.
Yeah, one point that I make, again, one comment I got was, there's a patriarchy that you ignore. It's not that I ignore it, it's that I wanna see it through the eyes of the women on the farm, and if they don't see it through the lens of a patriarchy, then I'm not going to either. But I can acknowledge that there is one, that's not my concern, right?
Yeah.
My concern is what they think technology means to them at the time, which really is a feminist perspective, right? Um and so, yeah, right. So this I start off with this kind of this part of the rural I make this claim that part of the rural urban conflict in the 20s and part of the debunking the hick or rube stereotype that farmers were trying to do with the use of technology had a gendered component. That for women it had an extra layer. The rube wasn't just a backward hick in the country, it was a bored woman that didn't want to be on the farm. And my contention is that for rural women, that's a imposition of a urban view of femininity on rural women. This whole dichotomy that men produce in the factory and women stay home and consume. That's a middle class, I contend, urban conception. Like the Ruth Schwartz Cowan More Work for Mother, that's an urban thing. Women are working on farms,
Right.
and they're producing
And
on
always
farms.
have been in big ways.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And so for these women in the 20s, and this isn't me making it up, this is them saying it.
Right.
I'm quoting them, right?
Right.
This is from quotes from rural women in the 20s.
Yeah.
They're not these bored housewives that don't want to be on the farm. They're business women, they're producers. And they see themselves that way, and their husbands see them that way. There's all of these examples I go off in the book about farms being modernized by the work women are doing, by the eggs that are being produced by women,
Mm,
that are not, as I said, they're not just producing eggs for the little farmers market down the
mm,
street. They're modernizing their large chicken houses, and they're shipping to cities, and
yeah,
they're playing the markets. This
yeah,
is a business. This
right.
is a big, and there's pictures of women from farm journals. They're not saying they're kind of, you know, baking or sewing. They're sitting at a table with a radio, jotting down prices to
Yeah,
se yeah,
yeah.
to sell, to work the market, and men are saying this in farm journals too, like, "We could build this new barn because my wife is this big, dairy producer." Um, and so women resist, it at the time, and I think, after that too, rural women resist this characterization, of them as kind of, bored, in some ways less feminine,
Mhm.
people on the farm, and they're saying, "No, we're producers. We have more to do with the business than you do, in your apartment city." And this is and so right, you see that even today, where even, I talk about the tractor shows and stuff like that. A lot of those shows are put on by women, um, because they identify with the rural modernity. So my argument is that rural capitalistic modernity, or well, it might seem, masculine from the outside. Rural women don't see it that way. They see it as family legacy. They see it as, and so there's a lot of resentment around, not only urban stereotypes about rudeness and, backwardness of rural people, but about rural women as being just consumers kind of stuck in the home. That's not reflective of their life, of their production. So they are producers. They see themselves as farmers essentially, through much of this history. And so I think, that's, I kind of got lucky because I wrote the first draft of this book in, before the 2016 election, but there's all this interest in, like, rural resentment. Um, but my argument is, like, that goes way back. This is not recent. Uh, this and production is part of it. Farm production is part of the rural resentment of the way they're seen by urban actors.
Mhm. Um, I don't know if you've ever bumped into this book. I forgot I meant to mention a little earlier in the interview, but it's this guy David Warren Sabian. And the book's called Property, Production, and Family in Neckarhausen. You ever bumped into this book?
No,
It's
I
a wild
haven't.
book, dude. You got to check it out. You'll love it.
Okay.
It's a he's a real social historian, but it's a history of this little German village, Neckarhausen, and it's all about farming patterns and stuff and how it changes over 150 years. So in terms of getting at Germanic farming traditions, I think you'd get a kick out of it. But one of the beautiful things is that it also shows, to your point about women working on the farm, that there was a shift in how they handled. I think, if I remember correctly, it was how they handled cattle, and they moved from kind of feeding to stall feeding, which was a big shift in how they handled workflows. But it actually intensified female labor. Like, women ended up doing all the stall feeding, and so women took up more of the farm work. And so it just, like, I think there are these very deep Germanic traditions actually of the how the family divides labor. And I just think you would get a kick out of this book, like,
Yeah,
given your
I
interests.
root it in German agrarianism, and in this, and I try not to argue that there's, like, no patriarchy, right? That's obviously not
No,
true.
no, and he writes
Or
about
that they're
patriarchy too.
equal in some
Yeah,
way. They're
no,
not
it's not
equal,
that. No.
but women see themselves as producers, and it
That's
goes
right.
back to
Yeah.
German agrarianism. I mean, there's all these things in my book about how, women have stories about how they were out in the field, on tractors, and they were, like, using this murderously heavy hay fork all day long, very, heavy labor intensive things. But yeah, by the 20s and 30s, if you look at animal production, as you're talking about, you look at, the poultry production, and you look at, even, yeah, cattle production. A lot of those jobs are not only done by women, but controlled by women. They're making the decisions about, production, about feeding, about selling. They're doing modern, and part of this modernity in the 20s isn't just technology, it's business practices. Women are doing modern accounting. They're going to, there's all these
They're
there's
making
also the home
plans and
demonstration.
stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and they're making decisions.
Yeah.
They're not they're managed. They're If you look at it and make it analogous to a non-farming workplace, they're upper management,
Right.
and because they're making the decisions, and the husband is doing making decisions about other parts of the farm, but it's all a productive unit. It's not like the woman just is doing what the man is saying. They're actually producing. And even further, there's examples in the 20s, 30s of husbands dying and the wife taking over the entire operation and making it even produce more, making it more modern. So there's definitely something to that. And there's also the home economics movement at the time,
Right.
which was highly gendered, right? And they did care about, what we think of traditionally female jobs, like, baking and sewing and whatever,
Canning.
taking care of children,
Yeah.
canning. But they're also, when you actually look at meetings in the Midwest, of women and people speaking to them about home economics, they're not using gendered terminology. They're actually talking about markets. They're talking about like USDA policy. They're talking about things that you would talk to any
Business person
group of
about.
producers or
Yeah.
business people about.
Yeah.
Right. So from their point of view, it was gendered, but it wasn't necessarily it wasn't dichotomous. It wasn't like women are in the home doing this and men are producing. It was not. That's an urban middle class invention. Not a rural one.
So in the book, you take us through the Cold War and how like this certain business conception of farming like really becomes the dominant image, and it does some certain ideological work. Then you take us through kind of like what you call rural globalized modernity, which I love, which is like, the increasing globalization that's happening through that period. You have this wonderful line in the introduction from your uncle saying something like, "This corn is going all over the world," as it's like shooting up, through the farm equipment. I love that. That was great. And then one of the places you take us to is like the rise of the organics movement and all these kind of new conceptions of farming. So why don't you tell that story to us and how you see it kind of relating to the story you want to tell about kind of rural modernity?
Yeah. So, I was thinking about this when I was thinking about these like discourses and identities. Over time, you could say, well, you have this discourse at this time, but then it's replaced by this other one. But I thought that's not really accurate, right? So the way I thought about it was actually I was watching my daughter in the front yard blowing bubbles. Uh, and I noticed that when she blew bubbles, some of them would like form together and then they would break apart and a new one would come out and the old two would still be there.
Yeah, yeah,
So I
yeah.
thought that's what it is, right? Because you have all these discourses and identities in the rural space, and you could reach out and grab any one and adopt any one of them. But once you do, it commits you to a certain type of use, right? It's not that all farmers have the same identity. So
Right,
it gets
right,
me
right.
beyond a
Well, there's
centralization, right?
subcultures of all sorts. Like there
Yeah,
are people who are into organics and all
right.
that stuff. There are people who are super into factory farming. There are Amish people out there. I mean, there's a lot of different cultures out in this space,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, so with the organic, I place that as arising from like the 60s, 70s environmental movement with Silent Spring comes out, and you have the post-Vietnam era where people are questioning institutions, including big ag, and the industrialization that I talk about or the mechanization that I'm talking about. And so my point though is that the organic discourses and identities, they still perform, they still engage in performative use, but the performance is with less advanced technologies. They've inverted the moral calculation. where newer technologies, particularly after World War II, after the Green Revolution, are less moral, and less technological objects are more moral. So they perform with less technological object, but they're still engaging in performative use, right?
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
take a
yeah.
view of technology as basically any object.
Yeah, me
And you can
too.
be
Yep, I'm
beyond
with
that
you.
too, like systems or ideas can even be people, can
Yeah,
be
stone
animals, can be
tools, whatever,
right,
animals, yeah, all that shit.
right. And so, but interestingly, they use some of the same elements of previous rural discourses and identities. So both urban, rural, modern capitalistic, and urban, rural modernity, and organic rural discourses, they both um, they both moralize land. They both moralize the family,
Mhm,
family-based
mhm,
production. They
mhm.
both there's a great, and I couldn't show this because I couldn't get permission from Barbara King Solver to use the picture, but there's this picture in one of her, I think it's Animal Miracle, one of the ones about my wife's really into Barbara King Solver and reading her. There's a great picture on the back of the cover where it's her with her family, and she's posing with the family. They've all got baskets and they've got less technological objects.
Right.
And then there's the exact same picture of a family in the rural Midwest posing the same way in front of their most expensive, newest tractor,
Yeah, exactly.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah,
it's like they're both using the family to moralize their production.
that's right.
That's German and Jeffersonian. They're both using the same rural
Tropes.
discourse
Yeah, yeah.
tropes. The difference is the technology. They see progress differently, right? The course of teaching on progress. To the organic identity, progress is the using the least technology, going back to kind of a utopian pre-modern
Right, it harkens back,
production.
there's, like, a nostalgic dimension to a lotta organic stuff, of looking back at the 18th and early 19th
Yeah.
centuries before all this shit, right?
And rural and modern identities actually see pre-industrial production as less moral. Those were the bad old days.
Right.
Those were the hard days. Those they associate with drudgery. So
Well, I
modern
mean,
rural, yeah, modern rural farmers, they see pre-technological work as drudgery, whereas organic discourses see it as moral, like getting your hands in the dirt, right? You hear all this like
Yeah,
discourse
yeah,
about
yeah.
it's moral and like it's like a spiritual thing to get your hands in the dirt. And
Yeah,
but to Midwest farmers, like that's old fashioned. Why would you want to
yeah.
do that?
That's inefficient
Um,
as hell because then you gotta go wash your hands, you know?
yeah, and it's hard. It's backbreaking, right? It's like, and there's all these stories in the Midwest about like how hard it used to be, like the bad old days. When I look how far we've come now, I have an air conditioned cab. That's moral to them because they've come that far. They've progressed.
Well, and
Whereas
they're feeding
organic
everyone
would
on
say
the
that's
planet
yeah,
too, right?
right.
I mean, there's that side of it too, where it's just like, all the agricultural change and just how many more people we're feeding today because of the way we do things, you know? And there's costs, there's downsides of all sorts. But it's also true that we're feeding a hell of a lot more people today. And so, I mean, I think that as you show that kind of global, your uncle and this corn's going all over the world, there's that image too of what we've done here in modernizing allows all this shit to happen, right?
Yeah, and the flip side of that coin is that their view of nature is different. So for organic, the moral landscape is the messy, less ordered landscape. Whereas for modern farmers, the straightness of your cornrows is like how you're judged, the lack of the weed in the field. They don't look at a field and see immoral monoculture. They
Right.
see order.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they
Yes.
see they see production, they see productivity, they see work, moralizing work going back to the German. Yeah, that's very German, right? It's like my fences are straight. Benjamin Rush says their fences are straight, they're perfectly painted. My uncle has you can't get in his car and bring dirt in there, he'll freak out, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like, I mean, he has a tractor that he sits on for, several weeks at a time planting, 20 almost 24 hours a day. There's not a speck of dirt on that thing. Um, and he drives around and he notices the rows of his neighbors. And that is a very different, but it's still moral because you know what happened in that field? My grandfather plowed that field with an ox when he was poor and he progressed, and now we have all these great technologies. Look how far we've come, right? So it's still the land, and
Yeah,
so that's
yeah,
something
yeah,
they
yeah.
share. The land
Yeah.
is moral, right? The land, and
Always. I mean,
that's
this is how
right.
groups work, I think, right? And they just
Yeah.
have different ways of narrating it. And but if we approach morality as social scientists, that's what we're gonna see is like human groups making sense of the world and trying to do what they think is good. And they have different
But
conceptions of what it is.
yeah, the reason I kind of try to describe this so in a detailed way is because when you look at policy controversies over agriculture, like I talk about the GMO debate,
Right?
um, and you read about the GMO debate in farm journals from farmers and farm editors. And their point of view is what's wrong with these dumb people? They don't even understand the technology. They think we're using all these chemicals. We're using like a Coke can of this chemical, and it allows us to, not get infested by bugs or resist drought. This is wonderful, right? And we're just out here trying to make a living in a moral way with our families as independent producers. And
Right.
these elite from the city are telling us we're doing this horrible thing. How there's this great blog post from a self-described farmer's wife in I think uh rural Indiana or Illinois, and she said, um something like you jump into your, SUVs and go to your Whole Foods and then tell me that like I can't use GMOs and it's bad for you. Give me a break, And then and
Yeah.
then and then yeah, and then you listen to, like, the GMO advocates, and it's this, like, huge affront to nature because 'cause they're taking genes that don't go
Yeah,
together, and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and they have meetings about this where they argue about it, and they throw, scientific studies at each other the whole time.
Yeah.
But it's my point is that's not what it's
Yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a classic STS
Yeah.
point in some ways that it's not. I mean, those journal articles are not going to solve the real tension here.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a profound point, but it's
No, no, no.
one
But
that
I'm just supporting what you're saying. I think
yeah.
I'm not like I'm not saying it's not original. What I'm saying is that, like what you've tried to do here is like really flesh out a worldview. Yeah. And then I think what you're doing, one of the things you're doing with the organic chapter is that you're showing like how, there's different ways of looking at this out there and there can be tensions, but also these
Mhm.
deep similarities. And so that's what I like about this project. I think as you've done this kind of social meaning of technology and looking at use in this is really all the work you've done to kind of reconstruct worldviews, which I think is a really essential part of what we do, what we should do.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of have a positive message at the end. I didn't want it. There's so much written about, industrialized agriculture that's very doom and gloom.
Yeah.
And my point is like because these two discourses have so much in common,
Yeah.
a new identity and discourse very well can be
That's
formed that
right.
reconciles these, right? They don't disagree
Well,
on
and I hope it
everything.
happens because, I think for the future of our American politics, it's got to happen, frankly. I mean, you can't have like all the rural states be red and have like, and as Democrats have a viable long-term future for, all kinds of issues we've got to tackle. So like people have to learn how to talk to each other. And part of it has to do with like learning for where people are coming from, I think. Right.
Yeah, and that's for me, that's really one of the most important, projects of our time right now is
Yeah.
that I mean, it's if we can't find common ground, like you said, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
Um,
Part of what,
and
yeah. Go ahead.
and we're all rooted in the same things, right? We're rooted in Jeffersonian and German agrarianism and progressivism. It's not like we're completely one's on Mars and one's on Earth. Um, so there's got to be room there, right? And just like in the 20s when you had Jeffersonian and German agrarianism, you have progressivism from the cities, they spawned this new rural modernity,
Right.
right? Why can't we can do that again? It's happened before.
Right.
We've
Yeah,
done
I mean,
it.
this is why one of the things I'm trying to do this year is just follow like the Democratic Party in West Virginia and a couple other in Appalachia basically and see what are they trying to do? What are the messages? What are the platforms in these spaces that they're trying to spin to win? I mean, what are the messages that they think will win in these places, and it's something that interests me a lot. So you got this new gig. you're teaching some classes this fall. Do you have a vision of like next projects, or are you going to kind of spend like a year or two getting teaching under your feet before you think about next things?
Well, I have some working papers that I need to get done.
Yeah.
And they all kind of center on use, on technological use and identity. And one of them is because I'm also a musician.
Right.
And part of this project, the insight I think came from, and I realized this later, my musical career, because I play the saxophone and I still play professionally.
Yeah.
And I've tried to give it up before because it's gets frustrating. The business part of it's frustrating.
My brother was a professional musician, as I told you, and he's not so much anymore. Now he's like he's like an administrator in the Chicago public school system because of what you're talking about. It's not easy.
Yeah, and every time I try to give it up, I can't.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, why do I need that saxophone? It's not because of money. I mean, I make money doing it, but it certainly isn't because of the money, right?
No, it's not because of the money.
Identity. It's because it's part of me and it's embodied, and it's just part of me. It just is.
Yeah.
Just like this tractor is part of my uncle. We all do it. This is a case study. It's not just about farmers. We all do this with technology. And so my paper that I'm working is how black jazz, I've mentioned Ray-Ban Fouché, but how black jazz musicians in the 20s and 30s used the saxophone to reshape it into a black instrument of black vernacular and black culture.
That's cool,
But
man.
beyond that, used it to insert blackness into American modernity.
Yeah.
And I talk about the resistance to that. And I take one company, which is the Conn saxophone company, which is the instrument I play from like the 30s. I love old Conn instruments.
Cool.
And if you look at these advertisements for Conn, they're trying to frame it as a white, respectable marching band or classical instrument.
Yeah, of course.
And they pioneered they actually pioneered a lot of technologies, but they also pioneered the endorsement, like using musicians to endorse their product.
Uh-huh.
And they're doing it in an era of which, for me, the big stars are African American or they're white jazz musicians, right? They're Dexter Gordon and Lester Young and people like that. Or Big Spiderbeck, they're white that they're playing.
Sure.
And none of these people are being acknowledged. And so I'm taking kind of Rachel Mann's idea of a camouflage technology, even though that paper's been debunked for historical factual reasons. I still like the idea of camouflaging. To argue that that these companies tried to camouflage the racial characteristic of their instruments to and there's all these editorials against jazz, and they're all really racialized. How it takes us back to the jungle and all these.
Yeah. Well, there's like Theodore Adorno and shit like that too later.
But it's in these magazines for the instrument, actually.
That's
and
cool.
How America needs to invent its own modern music, because otherwise we have this degenerate jazz.
Oh God! Oh, fuck.
Yeah, it's really, and then the article happens right after, and the only issue on the back where there's my jazz heroes, Cootie Williams, all these guys.
Yeah.
And then the very next issue, this guy writes this editorial, and then you don't see him again. And so I'm arguing that the battle was about whether and the saxophone was viewed as this very modern instrument because it required a lot of manufacturing, and it was like the new thing of the 20s is the jazz age. So the debate was actually about whether black culture would be part of America, this new American age, this new American modernity, and it was worked out through the saxophone.
I like it, man. That's cool.
Yeah. That's I got to get that. That's what I'm working on.
That's great, man. You should hook up at some point with Asif Siddiqui. I had him on. You should listen to the episode with him. And he's a historian of technology, and he did a book on it's called One Track Mind: Technology, Capitalism, and the Art of the Pop Song. But he's very kind of interested in this technology and music question. I think a lot of other people too. I mean, there's Trevor Pinch's stuff on the Moog. But I think we need more of it. Yeah.
Edward Jones Hematap has done stuff on
Glenn Gould, right? Yeah, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
I'm teaching a class called Algorithms in Society with this guy Dan Dunlap here at Tech this fall. he's a guitarist in a Pink Floyd cover band that's really great. And we were talking about doing like a social construction of rock music class, and like make class where you make pedals and shit. You know what I mean?
Oh, cool.
And he builds
Talk
amps.
about Les Paul and all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
The surfer stuff.
Yeah, fuzz
it's so
pedals
interesting.
and all that kind
Yeah.
of stuff. Hendrix, and get into all that,
I mean, rock and rock has a lot of the same argument that I'm making, where it
Right.
really, at first it wasn't called rock, it was called rhythm and blues.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the musicians were African American.
Sure.
The inventors were all black, and it was called race. A lot of this stuff came out of race records,
Right.
they called them, which was really late blues, but a lot of it is early rock.
Totally.
And there was all this conscious effort to find a white star, right?
Right.
We got
why?
Elvis.
Like,
yeah, exactly. And so, and the electric, you have, Rosetta Tharpe, which was like erased from history. She like was really instrumental in inventing the like rock guitar solo. There's a lot there.
Totally,
It's
man.
really cool. Yeah.
Well, Josh, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I've had a lot of fun with you, and I hope our paths cross in real life sooner than later.
For sure. Thank you, Lee. Yeah, I look forward to reading your research and your stuff on labor.
Thanks,
for
bud.
sure. It's coming up. Yeah.
I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com, or by following me on Twitter at sts_news, or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.